And I will make it brief because there's a lot to share with us. He's going to talk about his fabulous book, Freedom as Marronage, and he's going to talk about the ongoing work he's doing on natural goods. But let me just say a few things about him. As you know from his regular biography, he's associate professor of Africana Studies and Doctor of the Affiliate in Political Science at Williams College. Just got tenure last year, right?
That sounds about right. A year and a half ago?
Yeah, a year and a half ago, which is fantastic. He's a brilliant young scholar. I have to say that I knew this man when he was an undergrad. And it was through the Leadership Alliance and through another friend, Franz Lafarge. And Franz Lafarge, who's now also a colleague at Williams College. So these two young, brilliant people decide they're gonna become my interlocutors. So we've been having these conversations. I mean, they were speaking to me at a level of intense engagement that my colleagues weren't speaking to me. And they were undergrads. And I'm like, this cat's gonna be famous. You know, I'm gonna keep writing that. And it reminds me of my man Javier Munoz, who just joined the history department. He reminds me a lot of Javier, where undergrads were really thinking through really hard, difficult questions about the future, about questions of freedom. I mean, Neil was thinking about the question of freedom, particularly through C.L.R. James, from way back as an undergrad. So I mean, he's so impressed, and now he's like associate professor, big time, and author of this amazing book. So I just have to say that, and I continue to learn from him all the time. In addition to Freedom as Marronage, he's also co-editing, that should be out now, right?
It's out, yeah.
Yes, Theolizing Rousseau with Jane Anna Gordon. That's out. He's also finishing a political companion to Frederick Douglass, which includes a number of amazing writers and thinkers. His articles have appeared in many, many publications. I just want to give you the titles of some. Fanon's Rebel 50 Years Later, in Carib, Nordic Journal of Caribbean Studies, Violence, Liberty, Freedom in Small Acts, Henry Bird's Political Philosophy, Political Economy, and Late Modern Leadership, Antigua and Barbados Review of Books, and also State Power, Anarchism, Perspectives on Politics, which is kind of engagement with James Scott's work, as well as the notion of marronage. In other words, he is a political philosopher, political theorist, who's thinking about the space of freedom in relationship to forms or modalities of slavery and oppression, and that we think about freedom as flight from these things. And when you flee from those things, much like the Bible, like if you really think about, not to say that you think about the Bible, but if you think about like what the book of Exodus is really about, it's about flight and reproduction. And once you make that flight, you then make the new society. We always think about the slavery part, but not the new society part. And so what I think Neil was able to do is capture in the notion of marronage what it means to try to make that new society in flight, in escape, but then also know that it's never complete, because you escape modes of oppression that are at your shadow. You still have to keep remaking and remaking and remaking, which means our job is not nearly finished, but it's in the making that we make our freedom. So this is my phone. So with that, without further ado, Neil Roberts.
Well, it was summarized, so I guess we're done. I just want to begin with the series of thank yous. The first, I know one of the thank yous has person has to leave, but there are several people who I've known for a while who are here. One, Professor Aisha Finch, we were an undergraduate together. We were actually the same cohort of graduation in Afro-American Studies at Brown University, what was then a program and not a department. And that distinction is actually very important. And I gather also important here in terms of my understanding in terms of at UCLA, the fight, right, for African-American studies. So I just want to say, no, Professor Finch has to teach, but I wanted to just say it's really a delight to see you here. To Professor Robin Kelly, I could probably have a talk that was just based upon thank yous. But I do want to say that after that kind of that Leadership Alliance program, Professor Kelly did mention is there's a thing that used to be called a typewriter, and now most people didn't actually have it. But we actually used to have we actually used to exchange typewritten letters. I don't know if you remember this, but actually for a period of time, it was a program dedicated towards trying to encourage underrepresented students of color to consider graduate school, and so. This was really kind of informative in addition to your work, and so I just want to say thank you for the years of support, and also colleagues Melvin Rogers, Davide Pineglia, various other people, and also, most importantly, the young people that I see in front of me. So the format of the talk is going to be a little different than what I usually do, because in some sense I'm doing two talks in one. The first is I want to give the nuts and bolts of the argument on freedom as marronage. And I realize there may be some people have to leave early. I brought a few copies for those who may want to purchase it. Also, since I know people are in school, I have some flyers that have a 20% discount code. And then also, even if you don't pick up either, at least the talk, even if the ideas stimulate your imagination, then that's more than a success. And then the second, I want to actually talk about our working paper. So in some sense, the book is done, but this paper is unfinished. And so in many regards, I'm piloting something that I'm happy to get pushback on. But in the book, I do talk about the figure of Angela White Davis, who has a connection to this institution, not only importantly with regards to the period of 1969, but also as a recent visiting professor, and also the kind of the larger questions with regards to abolitionism that I want to get into. And so I want to start the talk by way of, I don't have a lot of props. I only got one thing, which is my personal website, which is very bare bones, nothing high-tech about it, and I've shepherded it in the different spaces that I've been, but it just has a few figures. I know some people can help me out. So let's start with let's start at the bottom. First figure. Anyone ever there? Yes. Hannah Arendt. Second. Frederick Douglass. Importantly, from his middle autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. We'll come back to the last figure. First one here. This may be a little more challenge for some people. Usually stumps people. This is the Nanny of the Maroons, who is also in one of the dollars in the current Jamaican dollar system. In the middle, baggy eyes, George Hagel. This is a little faded out. This is the elder C.L.R. James before he passed away. And this last image. Now I mentioned this last image because when I was on the job market, which is a kind of stressful thing, hopefully you don't have to worry about, where you're finishing your graduate degree and you're trying to figure out if you are trying to remain in academia, would there be employment? And so I interviewed at, let's call it a prestigious Midwestern institution. And I work in both Africana studies and political science. So in this case, it was a political science job. And there was a senior white scholar in international relations. And so I gave a talk that I thought was a pretty good job talk, and then after the talk, there's this kind of formula where there's a social, so you're supposed to try and appeal to everyone's sensibilities at the same time being very stressed. And so this senior scholar, though, very loudly cornered me and said, you know, Neil, that was a really interesting talk, but I wanted to ask you a question about your website. That's weird. I didn't have it projected like I did. I was like, okay. He's like, I searched your work. He's like, I want to know why Pam Grier website. And mind you, it was seemingly cornered, but it would be like this whole room hearing that, and also a room of that person's colleagues, right? And I'm this person who's trying to still say, okay, I'm trying to make this interview go well, but that racist. That misdesignation nonetheless is related to a larger issue with regards to Angela Davis, which was Davis as a figure who I read and taught several years. And then after that moment, over the years, I've kind of polled people who seemingly say they teach Angela Davis or dialogue with Davis. And I say, well, what works of Davis do you read? What do you know about Davis's background? And I can count on one hand, to this day, the actual text that people usually write about and discuss with Davis by the so-called enlightened. And then even others, there is this image, right? The image that we read, the Afro, seemingly black power. And so what I want to do in the majority of the talk is actually, if you'll indulge me, the first part is actually, in some sense, a bit of background to the figure of Davis that does connect to the principle. So hopefully that's just by way of beginning. So as a collectivity, I'm hoping you can all just repeat with me the word marronage 3 times. So can we say it? Marronage? Marronage. Second time? Marronage. Third time? Marronage. Marronage is a French word that is a noun that has the effect of a verb. It came into political language at the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century. Initially, it referred to Spanish colonists feral cattle who then fled to the hills. Then, during the period of enslavement, to enslaved Amerindians, who then, on the island of Hispaniola, which is the contemporary Dominican Republic in Haiti, who then fled to the hills to flee slavery, and then ultimately, with the transatlantic slave trade, to enslave Africans who then were running away from plantations. And so by the 1530s, this term came into being. Historically, there are usually two forms of marronage. You'll hear a term called petite marronage, which is just in the U.S., for those familiar with U.S. slavery, those are kind of individual runaways. So let's say there was from the plantation an individual who might by themselves, she or he, running away just at the existential level to have some temporary reprieve within a day, stealing away, or seeing loved ones across plantations, or surreptitiously planning different forms of escape. And then a second type, grand marronage, which Richard Price calls maroon society. So these are either communities in the hills, or in the case of the United States, Florida, the U.S. South, in the marshes, right, creating different enclosed communities. But I want to be clear that historically, and also anthropologically, there are ways in which marronage has its limitations. So if one thinks in terms of revolutionary politics, and I'll get that into a second, Maroons have, it's very a Janus-based history. So if one looks at, in the Caribbean context, between the revolution in St. Domingue, the Haitian Revolution that ended in 1804, and then between that and the Cuban Revolution that ended in 1959, the other polity that was closest to not simply having a revolt, but a revolution, was in the island of my birth, Jamaica, which in 1865, the year that the U.S. ended the Civil War, the Morant Bay Rebellion, which was kind of a famous rebellion that was on the cusp, of revolution, was killed because Maroons actually turned over Paul Bogle, who was one of the two main leaders of the Morant Bay Rebellion, and Bogle was subsequently executed with George William Gordon. So you're probably saying, well, why should we care about the idea of marronage? I'm interested, or at least I want you to think with me, if we actually then think of freedom as actually the process of flight from different forms of enslavement, not just in terms of micro-level politics, but also at the macro level. If we can actually think about that, whether we're talking about ancient Roman slavery, whether we're talking about the period of transatlantic slavery, whether we're talking about the contemporary forms of slavery, whether that's forced sexual work, human trafficking, or, as we'll talk about with Angela Davis, the question of those who are incarcerated within the prison industrial complex in prisons. If we can actually think about freedom as the flight, the ongoing processes of flight from those different forms of enslavement, then throughout space and time, this is opening up a different type of terrain. So in terms of just the core arguments of the book, perhaps let's start with the most controversial. I make an argument in this book that humans are born in a state of enslavement, that we are not born free. You may think, well, that just doesn't make any sense. I should think, speaking, though there are many historians here, history, I think, is on my side to suggest that the claim that we're actually all born free is just wrong, I mean, in my view. So I'm simply saying, well, let's perhaps indulge the opposite argument. And I know I don't have time to do this, but for those, just raise your hands, who've seen the Matrix trilogy? Have you guys seen the Matrix? Especially the first one? Yeah, young people, I figured at least. I'm not that old, right? I got the gray hairs, but, I'm not that old, right? The first Matrix trilogy, right? The main figure, right, Neo, who is, we know he's a boring day job, right? Neo's a kind of the 9-to-5 suit wearing. By the way, I only wear suits like 5 times a year. But right, he has a boring desk job. You guys know this, it might not be, but you're doing something. You're just clocking in, clocking out. I know those of you maybe on work study, right? You're doing things because not everyone gets that language lab job. I don't know if it's here, but there is a kind of way in which you're doing something because it's instrumental. It provides a certain type of end and substance. But we know, right? Neo his real passion was as an internet hacker. Right? There was a way in which the world seemed, as Rousseau said, well ordered. And yet, there was this intuition that there was something deep down was wrong. Something was off. And fast forwarding the story, right, Neo meets, right, Morpheus. Right? Or Morpheus. Right? And Morpheus says, right, he's got the cool glasses that I don't have, the tinted glasses. And then Morpheus says, ultimately, he meets Neo and he says, if you recall, you can take 2 pills. The first pill, you can ingest this and we'll have a conversation. Let's say we have this session here, and afterwards, everything that we just talked about, you'll just forget it, and you can go back into La La Land. I'll give you the second pill, and I can only offer you the truth. He takes the second pill, then the room starts to look like it bends, and then ultimately you see Neo, his eyes start to flush, and then all of a sudden he's sucked into a tube, and then eventually, what's the upshot? Is that Neo realizes that humans, right, are in this, they're being manufactured by machines. And we see literally plantations, right, that humans are being manufactured on plantations by machines, and the Matrix is a system of control, right, a system of alienation from that incipient reality of enslavement. And so while the book doesn't go minus a footnote into the Matrix at length, it is making a claim that we're all born enslaved. And if that's the case, then the second main claim of the book is against a kind of a famous theory by a scholar, Orlando Patterson, who wrote a famous book, Slavery and Social Death, in 1982, where he made the claim very magisterially that slaves across space and time are, right, like I'd call it likened to zombies, right? They're in a kind of a state, they're living zombies, right? They're non-agentic beings who simply are at the whim of a master. And I think while many of the claims in that framework are true, the sense that slaves, that we don't have the capacity for agency, I'm trying to challenge that. We might have a curtailed, is it making sense? We might have a curtailed capacity for action, but I'm just trying to suggest perhaps if we actually don't just think that we're living zombies and that we have the ability to change. We see this in Ferguson, we're seeing this in Baltimore, we're seeing in a lot of ways people recognizing that inherent ability for change that perhaps has been submerged because of global capital, because of the situations of the modern period, that then leads me to think that how then can we think again not of micropolitics, but of forms of flight that do involve questions of the exodus. There's a sense of physical flight, right, from point A to point B, right? Jews were enslaved and from Egypt, and then they are going back to homeland, or what, like a boomerang. Amy Césaire in the Discourse on Colonialism, he talks about the boomerang effect, right? That the ways in which Europe was caught because Europe thought that the things that Europeans were doing in the colonial slave trade wouldn't, right, come home to roost, right, within the belly of Europe, but that still is in the modality of physical forms of escape. I'm actually trying to get us to think, well, not to negate notions of exodus, but what does it mean within the spaces we actually exist in to have a form of revolutionary politics? Again, going to Ferguson, going to Baltimore. That's not about going to Africa. That's not about going back to some other home. That's about saying there is structural injustice in this political order, and we need to change it as well. And all of these things are occurring at once. And I want to end there to then do the reading part, which is what I usually don't do, which is to say this to Angela Davis, especially the figure of the fugitive. If you can take away anything from this one I'm about to read, is that I think Angela Davis has been someone for the last several decades, not just in her own being and activism, but also has been trying to encourage those of us concerned with social and structural and political reorderings to actually consider, I would say, a form of marronage that is very much intimately related to revolutionary politics. That's my goal for the rest. So I realize this form is going to feel a little bit different, but just try and hopefully I can keep your attention and then open it for question and answer. So again, this part, Angela Y. Davis, Abolitionism, Democracy and Freedom, tries to address the facets of the book that I don't. In the book I talk about not only the Haitian Revolution, and also figures such as Edward Glissant and the Rastafari, Philip Pettit, Hannah Arendt, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. People are surprised. Why is Samuel Taylor Coleridge in this book? I remember the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, but there's actually, I try and say more things than that. And this is trying to say, maybe this is what we need to think about in our current moment. Here goes. In an open letter to my sister, Angela Y. Davis, originally published in the New York Review of Books and included soon thereafter in an anthology edited by Angela Davis from prison with the assistance of Bettina Aptheker, James Baldwin wrote the following. The enormous revolution in black consciousness which has occurred in your generation, my dear sister, means the beginning or the end of America. Some of us, white and black, capital B, know how great a price has already been paid to bring into existence a new consciousness, a new people, an unprecedented nation. If we know and do nothing, we are worse than the murderers hired in our name. If we know, then we must fight for your life as though it were our own, which it is, and render impassable with our bodies the corridor to the gas chamber. For if they take you in the morning, they will be coming for us that night. End quote. Baldwin's words echo the early prophesying of the fire next time and presage what Baldwin would articulate in his last major essay, The Price of the Ticket. They were a plea in defense of a scholar activist imprisoned for a crime that she did not commit, a crime whose punishment would be death by execution with a guilty verdict. These words conveyed a belief that actions have a cost, that is, a price. For Baldwin, if a radical transformation in the actions of self, society, and state did not occur, at the epistemological and phenomenological levels, that is, at the level of knowledge and experience, that the new consciousness called for, then the human condition would be forever imperiled. The fate of Davis, he argued, was also our own. The context of Davis's status as a fugitive after being named to the FBI's 10 most wanted list, her 16-month incarceration, her disposition during oral arguments and testimonies presented during the trial, the people of the state of California versus Angela White Davis, and her subsequent acquittal were indeed dramatic. There was widespread national and international media coverage. American labor organizations questioned the validity of the charges against Davis. Coretta Scott King advocated for due process and a fair trial. The Hungarian critical theorist George Lukács likened Davis's trial to the Dreyfus affair in France at the turn of the last century. And the Women's Secretariat of the African National Congress and then apartheid South Africa demanded Davis's unconditional release. Much of this, however, has been well documented. But when looking beyond the surface of the spectacle of the trial and the constantly resurfacing photographic images from the late 1960s to the 1970s of our protagonist with the afro, right? This image right here, which is on the cover of our autobiography. When our soul looks back between past and future, as James Baldwin and Hannah Arendt suggest, one is able to observe through the life and times of Davis a significant cartography in African-American political thought. This terrain, however, requires greater exploration. To write about Angela Davis is to wrestle with the paradox of a figure known more for a particular aesthetic and period of incarceration than the overall content of her formidable work. The problem of biography and Africana thought, especially acute in discourse on Davis, is the asymmetrical attention analysts give to the details of black intellectuals' lived experiences at the expense of commentary on the interpretation of their ideas. Under this logic, knowledge of who a thinker is supersedes knowledge of what constitutes the principles of her or his thought. At the same time, however, there is an issue of circularity. Experiences may also prove useful in the formation of a thinker's key concepts, whether recounted in genres of autobiography, nonfiction, essays, historical fiction, poetry, music, or other mediums, and in the interpretation of these experientially derived notions. Davis remarks that, quote, philosophy is supposed to perform the task of generalizing aspects of experience, and not just for the sake of formulating generalizations. This paper, then, which extends the argument of freedom as marronage, heeds Davis's intuition, balancing the experiential and the interpretive, lining the often symbiotic relation between experience and theory integral to the study of politics. So I begin with the discussion of movements, texts, and figures, though I probably won't have time to talk about Herbert Marcuse, both central to the intellectual development of Davis and most representative of Davis's political thought. And it frames Davis's body of work as a form of fugitive theory and practice, whose 19th century intellectual roots provide a unique vista only partially mined by contemporary theories frequently associated with fugitive thought. Next, I narrow scope by turning to an examination of three concepts fundamental to the work of Davis. First, abolitionism. The second, democracy. And the third, freedom. Davis's analysis of W.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass are vital to elucidating these notions. And I also contend that understandings of abolitionism that Davis marshals mediates her articulations of democracy and freedom. Davis doesn't claim to invent all or even most of the categories and terms integral to her thought. It is the way she integrates older, new concepts into a defined political system concerned with actors and institutional arrangements that distinguishes her. Deciphering how Davis arrives at these core tripartite ideals challenges us to refashion facile, sanitized origin narratives of the contours of African American political thought. And so to the first, the life and times. Born in Birmingham, Alabama, Angela Yvonne Davis, born 1944, grew up in a middle-class African American family that witnessed the horrors of violence and interracial distrust in the Jim Crow South. During much of her youth, the Davis family lived in a segregated neighborhood nicknamed Dynamite Hill, due to recurring bombings and acts of terror leveled against its black inhabitants at a time when neighborhoods containing whites and blacks in the South were rare. So common were the bombings of Dynamite Hill, Davis recounts, that the horror of them diminished. And as a side note, Davis grew up in the same town, a neighborhood as Condoleezza Rice. And Condoleezza Rice, for those who don't know, was also very close to Angela Davis's older sister. In the late 1950s, Davis moved to New York City with her family's support and attended Elizabeth Irwin, a progressive Quaker school. She lived with a white family, and it was during this time that Davis was introduced to various socialist writings, chief among them the Communist Manifesto. Davis also attended meetings of a radical youth group, Advance, whose sessions were convened at the home of historian and communist activist Herbert Aptheker, and attended by persons such as Mary Lou Patterson, child of noted black communist William Patterson, and Aptheker's daughter, Bettina, with whom Davis would build an enduring intellectual and political relationship. Davis subsequently enrolled at Brandeis University, where a few key experiences as an undergraduate forever changed her future trajectory. Listening to James Baldwin speak at a rally as news of the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded, attending a public lecture by Malcolm X, majoring in French literature, meeting Herbert Marcuse, studying abroad at the Sorbonne in Paris, listening to lectures by Theodor Adorno in Germany the summer prior to returning to Brandeis, taking Marcuse's graduate seminar on Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason after returning from abroad, and writing a senior thesis in 1965 entitled The Novels of Robert Grier, A Study of Method and Meaning. In the United States, the civil rights movement had gained momentum. Groups, particularly the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the quote-unquote New Abolitionists, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, fostered leadership among young people fighting the American Jim Crow racial order. The rise of black power nationalism as a major political tendency within the United States, the circulation of Frantz Fanon's understandings of resistance and revolution, and the founding of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, with its subsequent consolidation of a 10-point program, further impacted Davis, notwithstanding criticisms of a male chauvinism she came to associate with leadership in branches of the Panthers' evolving membership. In Germany, the Socialist Student League, or SDS, and student protest movements additionally shaped Davis's belief that young people were and still are as vital to elders to the achievement of social and political change. Only in the 1970s did the women's movement, imperatives of third world feminists, transnational feminist politics, and black feminist challenges to earlier waves of feminism, not least of which were the Combahee River Collective's catalytic black feminist statement. Not only then did it become an integral part of Davis's oeuvre. The publication of Reflections on the Black Woman's Role in the Community of Slaves in 1971, written from prison, Women in Capitalism, Dialectics of Oppression and Liberation in 77, Rape, Racism in the Capitalist Setting in 78, Women, Race and Class in 1981, Violence Against Women and the Ongoing Challenges to Racism in 1985, and Women, Culture and Politics in 1988 signaled this shift. And Davis remarks in that first work, Reflections, the following: "A great deal has been said about the black man, italicized man, and resistance, but very little about the unique relationship black women bore to the resistance struggles during slavery. To understand the part she played in developing and sharpening the thrust toward freedom, the broader meaning of slavery and of American slavery in particular must be explored. The black woman's consciousness of the oppression suffered by her people was honed in the bestial realities of daily experience. We, the black women of today, must accept the full weight of a legacy wrought in blood by our mothers in chains. Our fight, while identical in spirit, reflects different conditions and thus implies different paths of struggle. But as heirs to a tradition of supreme perseverance and heroic resistance, we must hasten to take our place wherever our people are forging on towards freedom." By the mid-1960s, Davis's political thought was influenced by Marcuse's mentorship and the intellectual currents of Frankfurt School critical theory, to which Marcuse was a contributor, the ethical dimensions of Hegelian and Marxist thought, black social movements, and existential phenomenology. Upon graduation from Brandeis, Davis moved to Germany to pursue graduate studies with Adorno. However, in the 2 years she was at Goethe Universität, Davis felt removed from what she refers to as, quote-unquote, the new black militancy, emerging back home in response to heightened white supremacist terror towards the bodies and souls of black folk. Adorno's written interpretation of negative dialectics, the ontological need, world spirit, and metaphysics, while expansive in the abstract, mirrored a pedagogical philosophy lacking emphasis on experience. Its premises additionally echoed Jacques Rancière notes are disagreements between theorists and their beliefs on the applicability of ideas to living world politics. The insistence of Adorno on the separation of theory from politics, a view Marcuse rejected, further disillusioned Davis. As she wrote regarding the obstacles often confronting scholar activists, she wrote the following: "I wanted to continue my academic work, but I knew I could not do it unless I was politically involved. The struggle was a life nerve, our only hope for survival. I made up my mind, the journey was on." And I imagine many of you in this room wrestling with that same point. Davis returned to the U.S. as a result and entered a doctoral program in philosophy at the University of California, San Diego, in order to work with Marcuse, who had left Brandeis by then. Marcuse was a humble scholar of the New Left whose studies of Hegel, Marx, Freud, and the meanings of liberation, the aesthetic dimension, and revolution were well known among academics and increasingly visible lay audience who sought guidance into how critical theory could be made relevant to the everyday. Marcuse was a guide and a mentor for Davis, and Marcuse in turn would learn very much from Davis' scholar activism. Davis became enamored with Marcuse's critique of one-dimensional society, rejection of using socialism as a dirty word. musings on solidarity, articulation of the relationship between aesthetics and politics, and faith in the possibility for realizing utopian projects. Marcuse advocated for radical utopian politics, aware, as he noted in Counter-Revolution and Revolt, that there were agents of repression who considered it, as he wrote, a crime to talk about change. Literally just to talk about it, not even to do it. Developing a strategy of change and systematic approach towards racism, resistance to racism, subordination of women, undemocratic orders, and orders of unfreedom. Great refusals against the establishment, in Marcuse's political language, were aspirations Davis began to chart in terms Marcuse and others did not outline. Davis's doctoral work, just a little more biography, trust me, we need this to get through. Davis's doctoral work was part of this larger endeavor. She embarked upon a dissertation on Kant's theory of force vis-a-vis the French Revolution. At the same time as writing the dissertation, Davis plunged deeper into Marxist thought and modes of socialism. Like Grace Campbell, Louise Thompson-Patterson, Lucy Parsons, and Claudia Jones earlier, Davis contributed to a stream of intersectional black Marxism that integrated the phenomenology of black women's existence into its activities. Strikingly, major studies of black Marxism and Marxist political economy often elide this fact, including, and I know one person at least in this room holds this dear, Cedric Robinson's Magisterial Black Marxism, including the revised 2000 edition. Davis joined the Southern California chapter of the Che La Mumba Club, an affiliate of the Communist Party USA, and began organizing on behalf of political prisoners. This launched a long-term ongoing project criticizing the entire penal system itself. Davis would later run for Vice President of the United States under the CPUSA ticket, continuing to question how the vectors of gender, class, race, age, and ability simultaneously structure human lives before the word intersectionality was coined. In 1969, Davis started a position here as junior faculty member in the UCLA philosophy department while in the final stages of completing the study on Kant. Davis did not complete the UCSD dissertation, however, maintaining to this day that the FBI stole all of her dissertation materials in 1970. But this is the period, right, this is the part I think is fairly well mined, right? This is the period most commentators have described, the period of the Angela Davis who was fired from UCLA by the State Board of Regents under Governor Ronald Reagan's recommendation, the period when her two stunning lectures on Frederick Douglass were delivered, and the phase when Davis was incarcerated, placed on trial, and acquitted. But I want us to get into some other terrain, which we can call fugitive theory and fugitive practice. It shouldn't surprise anyone that Davis employs in Angela Davis, an autobiography in 1974, a text that she calls in its preface a political autobiography, as well as in her many prison essays from the 1970s, including Political Prisoners, Prisons and Black Liberation, Lessons from Attica to Soledad, Trials of Political Prisoners Today, and Notes for Arguments in Court on the Issue of Self-Representation. A style of writing inherited from 19th century Black American fugitive slave authors Harriet Jacobs, Henry Box Brown, Lucienne Delaney, and above all, in her case, Douglass. The experiences of fugitivity and incarceration shaped the commitments of Davis to defining democracy and freedom, and they bolster her resolve to merge theory and practice in spelling out the conceptual terrain. If Marcuse, Du Bois, and Douglass are central thinkers Davis revisits throughout her intellectual corpus, then it's the tradition of fugitive theory and practice introduced by the third figure where we locate the origins of Davis's thought. Contemporary political theory tends to treat the writings of Sheldon Wolin, Gaz Deleuze, and their adherents as a sum total of discourse on fugitivity. This bracketed genealogy indeed offers many insights: the idea of becoming, lines of flight, the movement image, the evanescent nature of democracy, the late modern specter of inverted totalitarianism, and the perspective of freedom as process-oriented. These claims, nevertheless, have earlier formulations from the previous century. In other words, what I'm saying is some people wrote about that beforehand. Davis recovers them first through the prism of Douglass, and secondly with Du Bois, demonstrating the extent to which our lived experiences, especially the experiences of slavery, struggle, and assertion, matter. Davis, however, engages and challenges, and this is an important point, she also challenges Douglass's conception of freedom. Narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave written by himself, and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass serve as the sources of inspiration for interpreting fugitive slave phenomenology, whilst the Douglass of the middle autobiography, Douglass of the image in the bottom in the middle, actually are closer in argumentation to several of Davis's proposals. Davis's Du Bois is the Du Bois who saw himself as the intellectual heir to Douglass, completing tasks Douglass left unexplored. Douglass left unexplored. The post-Souls of Black folk Du Bois, who wrote a biography of John Brown and Darkwater, and Du Bois, the fugitive democratic theorist whose thought was in transition when rewriting the historiography of radical Reconstruction and its discontents. African-American thought reveals how fugitivity connects to the experiential and to the condition of liminality, wherein an agent struggles both with regards to oneself and in relation to others. Fugitivity is irreducible to escapology. It's not simply about fleeing, right, out there, over there, somewhere else, right? An act whose sole aim is to retreat from interfering, coercive, and hegemonic agents. The experience of fugitivity is inextricably linked to flight, to marronage. As I detail in Freedom as Marronage, fugitivity encompasses different types of marronage, each type comprising physical, metaphysical, and social structural valences. Flight entails a rejection of negative arbitrary interference and domination, as well as the positive construction and cultivation of a democratic and free existence for individuals and collectives. Moreover, examining fugitivity discloses the insufficiency of conceptual frameworks in Western political thought whose binary of democratic, undemocratic, or free or unfree assumes static, inert polarities, and excluding, right, this area in the middle that we're all struggling toward or against. It is the daily acts of struggle and assertion occurring within the interstitial spaces between these imagined absolute binary conditions where democracy and freedom actually reside. The indeterminate, unsettling nature of a fugitive's existence nonetheless offers a suggestive avenue for the emergence of an alternative condition and creation of another world. And Davis provides a startling formulation of this viewpoint. And so, for the rest of the time, the last 15 minutes, because I want to get to questions, or 20 minutes or so, I want to get to questions with regards to defining how we can think about abolitionism, and then how Davis thinks about that with regards to democracy and freedom. Abolitionism refers to, or we can think of it as referring to processes of eradicating the condition of slavery between past and future. The temporal dimension of this definition underscores the experience of slavery as the foundational human condition, the ability of individuals and collectives to exit from the state, and the capability of an agent or agents no longer enslaved to return to this condition. The life of an enslaved agent is undemocratic and unfree. As with modes of action related to the attainment of democracy and freedom, the activity of abolitionism remains ongoing. Frederick Douglass views slavery as, quote, the granting of that power by which one man exercises and enforces a right of property in the body and soul of another, end quote. For Davis, slavery alienates human beings from themselves. Slavery distorts perception, preventing humans from the actualization of self-consciousness and consciousness raising. Slavery's logic persists whether the manifestation of one form of enslavement is identical or differential to another form across various social and political orders. Types of slavery, like modes of flight, include but are not limited to the domain of the physical. And slavery also is able to persist in spite of orders declaring, quote unquote, emancipation and independence. So in the US context, right, this is the 1865 mode, right? You get emancipation, and then the assumption is, well, freedom has been, right, achieved, or call it the rise and fall of Reconstruction, or call it 1963, or call it Obama's election in 2008, right? These kind of senses in which there are these moments in which it might seem like a contradiction, but I want to try and have you think about the ways in which it is not necessarily. If slavery was declared dead, Davis observes, then it was simultaneously reincarnated through new institutions, new practices, and new ideologies. I'm going to skip a little bit in terms of the discussion of Orlando Patterson and social death, just to get at this particular point that Davis makes with regards to with enslavement comes natality, the possibility of an agent's resistance to a constrained agency, potentiality for an authentic upheaval, and prospects of liberation and revolution through abolitionism. We can learn from the philosophical as well as concrete experience of the slave, Davis maintains, because the slave offers us a window into the struggles and matrices of abolitionism. Abolitionism is a consistent presence throughout Davis's political thought. We observe this notably in the lectures on liberation, published in 1969, though published in 71. If They Come in the Morning, 71, Angela Davis's autobiography. Joanne Little, The Dialectics of Rape. Women in Capitalism, Women, Race, and Class. Blues Legacies and Black Feminism, Gertrude Maud Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Billie Holiday in 98. Racialized Punishment and Prison Abolitionism in 98. From the Prison of Slavery to the Slavery of Prison, Frederick Douglass and the Convict Police System. Are Prisons Obsolete in 2003. Abolition and Democracy 2 years later. And The Meaning of Freedom in 2012. Davis's lecture courses over the last several decades, numerous activities as a political organizer, and advocacy of the Committees of Correspondence, Critical Resistance, Incite, Women of Color Against Violence, the Sentencing Project, and the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and related intolerances among them also support this. Abolitionist politics pertaining to racial slavery, the death penalty, and thirdly, the contemporary prison system preoccupied Davis, though in our contemporary moments, especially with Baltimore, a lot of discussions with regards to should the police be abolished, right? Kind of police abolitionism are related to this as well, but Davis focuses on those first three. The first wave of American abolitionists in the 18th and 19th century are a heterogeneous constellation of black slaves on plantations, fugitive slaves, free people of color, and whites devoted to slavery's demise. Abolitionists are not anti-slavery activists who abhor Southern slavery while remaining neutral on the westward expansion of slaveholding states, which was essentially Abraham Lincoln's position for a large part of his career. They argue for the obliteration of slavery across the Confederacy, the emergent Midwestern and Western states forged under the expansionist doctrine of manifest destiny, and the small but existent slaveholding states of the Union. Davis makes it a point, though, to highlight how the abolitionist struggle against racial slavery in the U.S. does not end with the and this is an important point, does not end with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Effective after the Civil War's end, the 13th Amendment declares the following: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Davis writes in From the Prison of Slavery to the Slavery of Prison that an amendment, she writes, putatively freed black labor from the total control to which it was subject during slavery. In actuality, new forms of quasi-control developed. Chapter 1 of Women, Race, and Class, entitled The Legacy of Slavery, Standards for a New Womanhood, adds texture to this inquiry, as does Davis's following assertion in The Meaning of Freedom. It strikes me to be very strange that over the decades we've assumed that it was possible to abolish slavery simply by proclamation, a few words here and by a clause in the Constitution, when the Emancipation Proclamation and that constitutional amendment never clearly explain how they understand slavery. Davis also remarks in Our Prisons Obsolete. After the abolition of slavery, former slave states passed new legislation revising the slave codes in order to regulate the behavior of blacks in ways similar to those that had existed during slavery. The new black codes prescribed a range of actions such as vagrancy, absence from work, breach of contracts, the possession of firearms, and insulting gestures or acts that were criminalized only when the persons charged were black. With the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, slavery and involuntary servitude were putatively abolished. However, there was a significant exception. The duly convicted clause of the 13th Amendment functions as a constitutional clause of exception under the rule of law. It sanctions the perpetuation of the instruments of chattel slavery and the involuntary bondage of another, so long as there is juridical justification for conviction and punishment of a criminal. It authorizes treating the incarcerated criminal as a slave. The 13th Amendment is a blessing and a curse for what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. Salome Shah Tillett, the sights of slavery. Judah Squire, the specter of slavery haunting post-bellum America. Stephen Hahn, slave agency and revolt in an enslaving political order. Paige Dubois, the perpetuation of reducing humans to objects. And David Bryan Davis, the problem of slavery in the age of black emancipation. It marks a legislative victory for tempered anti-slavery supporters and a Pyrrhic victory for abolitionists who foresaw the mutations of slavery, biopolitics of violence, and continuation of white supremacy leading to black codes, gendered subjugation, the routinization of lynching, the appearance of the convict lease system, sharecropping, the breakdown of radical reconstruction, and Jim Crow segregation, and should the comprehensive dismantling of the peculiar institution not occur. This part of the paper is a bunch of long sentences, so bear with me. As Angela Davis uncovers, by maintaining vestiges of the prison of slavery following 1865, the slavery of the prison and the death penalty come into being. The neo-slave narratives of today's fugitives and imprisoned intellectuals, self-referentially known as the new abolitionists, among them Assad Shakur and Mumia Abu-Jamal. And Assad, of course, is case with regard to normalization of U.S.-Cuba relations has come back into discussion. The scale of contemporary global human trafficking, the stark militarization of American police forces over the last 5 decades, a phenomenon whose emergence coincides with the genesis of SWAT teams deployed in communities of color. The exponential expansion in the number of prisons over the last quarter century, filled disproportionately with black and brown bodies, at the same time as massive cuts to public education and services have taken effect. The ongoing dehumanization of black life, captured in the powerful social media tumblers I Can't Breathe and Black Lives Matters. The quotidian phenomenon of lethal gendered and racial violence against black youth, represented by the events of Renisha McBride and Ayanna Stanley Jones, Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, John Crawford III, Tamir Rice, and recently in Baltimore, Freddie Gray. The proliferation of states' rights arguments inherited from John C. Calhoun on the one hand, and an equally pernicious contemporary discursive post-racialism on the other. And imagine in California system, that's anymore, right? This post-racial term, which Lewis Gordon says is post-racialism is just a contemporary form of racism that is now ashamed of itself. Right? And Michelle Alexander's scathing indictment of mass incarceration, a late modern new Jim Crow mirroring the old Jim Crow and the formal period of New World slavery preceding it, all lend credence to the rationale Davis develops for upholding an abolitionist philosophy fundamental to her scholar activism. I know I get 10 minutes, I'm going to do the power 10. Democracy section and the freedom section, 5 and 5. Democracy section. The prison, more than the related but distinct politics of the death penalty, is Davis's unique area of philosophical reflection in abolitionist political involvement. In Davis's estimation, prisons are the exemplary spaces displaying the mutations of chattel slavery in our political present. Prisons harbor the new technologies of slavery. Prisons show the gendered facets of penality. Prisons are the thematic preoccupation in the lyrics of black blues singers, including Bessie Smith and Gertrude Mulroney. And of course, there's an HBO documentary, for those who haven't seen, on Bessie Smith, just came out. Prisons are undemocratic in their order. Prisons emphasize punishment rather than discipline, rehabilitation, and reform. An insight Michel Foucault learned from Davis, not the other way right around, when he advocated on her behalf through the group D'Information sur la Prison. American prison inhabitants are, at the level of biopolitics, overwhelmingly persons of color, and within that demographic, disproportionately black. For all her laudatory words on Frederick Douglass, Davis trenchantly criticizes the philosophy of history, enabling Douglass's failure, firstly, to critique the convict lease system throughout his career, which is the kind of system in the 19th century that was a progenitor to our contemporary prison industry, and secondly, the inattention of Douglass to lynching until the last phase of his life. Of the two issues, Ida B. Wells Barnett was successful in challenging Douglass to address only the latter. The convict lease system, Davis maintains, carried over the relations of slave labor into the era of emancipation. The magnitude of convict leasing would reach its zenith with the downfall of Reconstruction, and it would be the basis of the subsequent rise of the modern panopticon prison structure. Justifications for the criminalization of black bodies and the condemnation of blackness after emancipation also have their roots in convict lease. While Davis notes Du Bois's brief commentary on convict leasing in an obscure missionary journal, an essay, like the writings of Mary Church Terrell, that fills in voids left by Douglass, it's Du Bois' study on the relationships among fugitive slaves, masters, the undemocratic slaveholding republic, and the abolitionism that Davis builds upon in her own Abolitionism. Davis, though, does so in a manner Du Bois never fully investigates. Davis considers the slavery of prison both as a key bulwark of the undemocratic life and an essential phenomenon analysts should examine to decipher, she writes, the nature of democracy, or what goes under the rubric of democracy in America. Informing this outlook, she harkens back to Du Bois' 1935 Black Reconstruction in America, a tone describing a Manichaean polity in the Reconstruction years spanning roughly 1865 to 77, a republic containing dually a black world and a white world. But Du Bois does look back towards slavery repeatedly, juxtaposing the antebellum social and political order of the black and white worlds to the America during and after Reconstruction in order to reconsider existing narratives about the agents thought to have caused the outbreak of the Civil War, the fight over slavery's future, and the struggle for democracy. The true significance of slavery in the United States to the social development of America lay in the ultimate relation of slaves to democracy, Du Bois writes. Furthermore, Du Bois suggests what made the abolition movement terribly real was the fugitive slave, the piece of intelligent humanity who could say, I have been owned like an ox, I stole my own body, and now I am hunted by law and lashed to be made an ox again. The fugitive slave's experience of flight is one of trepidation and hope, struggle an integral factor while engaging in the activity of exiting an undemocratic order and zone of non-being from a standpoint of liminality. Fugitive slaves have dreams, visions, aspirations, some individualistic, others collective, sometimes realized, other moments merely a potentiality. But here is, in some sense, and I won't go into all the discussions of Du Bois, but something that Du Bois writes about not only Black Reconstruction as an implicit in color and democracy, is a term often associated with Davis, which is abolition democracy. Whereas inquiry into the 19th century fugitive slaves is backward-looking, abolition democracy has to do with the past, the present, and the future. Abolition democracy involves imagining the means and methods through which a fractured American democratic project in need of restructuring, in the Matrix analogy, in need of rebooting, right? After a short-lived Reconstruction can become sutured. Du Bois envisions two routes for a future postbellum America, one defined by private profit, the maintaining of structures of slavery, and a ruling elite, what contemporary activists in the Occupy Wall Street movement would classify as the rule by the 1% over the 99%. The second defined by commitment to abolition democracy, a notion of enslavement that views any remnants of slavery as an inhibitor to democracy. Davis's brilliant, if controversial, and certainly illiberal conclusion is that the entire late modern prison system must be abolished. No, she does not mean fix the prison system or reform the parameters of how the prison operates. All prisons must be made obsolete. And Davis urges us to think of a world beyond carceral states, a world where a single standard is the norm, decarceration. I don't have time to read the rest of it, but in essence, what I talk about is also the ways in which Davis encourages us to think of, people think, well, that prisons are like, laws of gravity, right? This goes up, this goes down, it's not going to change, it's always been that way. But she's saying, but even in the U.S. context, there was not always this system that has now been almost considered right, like a law of nature, right? So what would it, you guys understand, what would it mean to actually think beyond something that was never natural, right, to begin with, and perhaps that is where we can think. And Davis's involvement, not just in the U.S., but also the last several decades with figures and organizations within post-revolutionary Cuba and post-apartheid South Africa, the latter notably in the period of transition to Nelson Mandela's administration after Mandela's release from prison, and heated debates, as Drusilla Cornell notes, surrounding the integration of the philosophy of Ubuntu into South African jurisprudence, demonstrates a commitment to these abolitionist principles nationally and internationally. So that was my first 5 minutes to democracy, last 5 minutes to the freedom valence. We're now, I think, able to understand why freedom is the second and final concept mediated by Davis's idea of abolitionism. In the opening of the Lectures to Liberation, Davis probes the following existential paradox. The idea of freedom has justifiably been a dominant theme in the history of Western ideas. Man has been repeatedly defined in terms of his inalienable freedom. One of the most acute paradoxes present in the history of Western society is that while on the philosophical plane, freedom has been delineated in the most lofty and sublime fashion, concrete reality has always been permeated with the most brutal forms of unfreedom, of enslavement. Is man free or is he not? Ought he be free or ought he not be free? The history of black literature provides, in Davis's, she writes in mine, that is Davis's opinion, a much more illuminating account of the nature of freedom, its extent and limits, than all the philosophical discourses on this theme in the history of Western society. And it's really through these lectures that I think that Davis, not only her engagement with Douglass, but also her attempt to look at a particular form of marronage actually gives us some meaning. Davis believes entrenched traditions in Western political thought portraying unfreedom and freedom as static conditions are intellectually deficient. If enslavement is the original human condition and ultimate unfreedom, then it's through flight that an agent extricates oneself, thereby turning the so-called paradox on its head. And it's resistance, the product of an action or assemblages of actions that catalyzes change in an agent's condition. Resistance against slavery, integral to the wider Great Refusal, has different modes of enactment. And there's one facet that Davis looks at that Du Bois and Douglass do not, which is giving explicit explication in transnational black feminist thought and politics, specifically through her work, Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism, which is the aesthetic dimension. And I'll end with this. Whereas Marcuse probes generally the radical potential of art and Du Bois the power of the sorrow songs, the Negro spiritual of Davis limes the contributions of African-American blues singers and jazz musicians, most notably Billie Holiday, to resistance and abolitionism. Lady Day's trenchant chanting of lynching, Strange Fruit, expresses the hatred of racist-inspired brutality with the rage of a potential community of resistance. The later utterances of jazz singers Abby Lincoln and Nina Simone, and as well as more recently hip-hop musician Kanye West in Blood on the Leaves in his album Yeezus, mark the reverberations of Lady Day's classic work, which Davis finds of enduring intellectual value. Moreover, 158 pages of Blues Legacy are Davis's original transcriptions of lyrics from 252 songs by Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith. The blues and jazz, in Davis's estimation, are songs of freedom. Documenting the entire work of Rainey and Smith, along with the exegesis of Holiday, offers lyrical thought archive on aesthetics, intersectionality, and politics. And there's just something I want to read here, which is the aesthetic concerns the beautiful, and it's a dimension entailing more than just judgment of outward appearance. There's a beauty in resisting unfreedom in spite of the arduous abolitionist politics often associated with it. The aesthetics of resistance represents a central bulwark of post-emancipation fugitive thinking within black freedom struggles and the black radical tradition. Davis looks at not only the phenomenon, not only how we can think about freedom with regards to the mind, but also, lastly, with regards to revolution. In a speech delivered on behalf of the Soledad brothers published on September 11, 1970, a historical irony viewed in hindsight, given the numerous claims at the conjuncture that our protagonist was a terrorist, is in the issue of Life magazine featuring Davis on the cover with the caption, "The Making of a Fugitive." Davis contends the following: liberation is synonymous with revolution. And she states that revolution is not just armed struggle, it is not just the period, it's not just the period in which you can take over. A revolution has a very, very long spectrum. Note, however, that Davis distinguishes between the concepts of freedom and liberation, and she conceives of revolution, which is to be equated with liberation, as requiring the merging of the personal and the political and the building of collective spirit. And where I end is essentially saying that Davis's engagement, especially with Douglass, are first the narrative. So I won't say you have to raise your hands. My general experience is that when talking to people about Douglass's autobiographies, there are many who read the kind of the narrative of life in Frederick Douglass, still in a lot of school systems, kind of like Kant's, groundwork of the metaphysics of the world, of morals, kind of 100-page text. And then if you want to know more about Douglass's life, then the assumption is, oh, go to his last autobiography, The Life of Times, which Davis does. But it's actually in the middle autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, that Douglass actually makes, one of the things I trace in Freedom is marronage, is that he actually adds the words comparative and comparatively throughout the book, and throughout the kind of famous, the nods are probably the kind of famous fight with Covey scene, right? It's kind of the famous slave breaker, Edward Covey, where it's this 2-hour fight. I liken that to the first Matrix. I call it the Neo scene. Do you know the scene when Neo goes underneath the railroad, underneath the subway system, and the agents, right? Because the agent is someone who they say, if you encounter an agent, what? Run, right? And then Neo turns around, and what does Morpheus say? He's starting to believe, right? Yeah. So they have this fight where the chicken on Harry goes against the wall, and at the end of that fight in the movie, right, is Neo free? He's won the battle, not the war, right? And in Douglass, in the narrative, he has this 2-hour fight with a slave breaker. He's not free legally, he's not free. But if you guys want at the level of the mind, there is a mutation that happened. One of the things that I traced, and it was completed by accident, is that Douglass added this word, this adjective, he has a comparative or comparatively, all throughout similar sections, including the famous fight with Covey scene, that actually suggests that he was saying, well, perhaps there is a comparative and relational nature to what freedom is. And when orders, an individual's experience in life or social and political orders, when they restructure, there are ways in which it's always in relation to something else, right? And then he disavows that move in not only the later autobiographies, but in his political life. And so I really end, where this ends is suggesting that while Davis is right to criticize aspects of Douglass, she actually talks about the idea of liberation being unfinished. So if we go back to the Matrix, if you think of the scene when they're in the helicopter and Morpheus, they're trying to rescue Morpheus and his eyes, has his chains and his eyes are fluctuating, and then all of a sudden they say, run, Morpheus, listen to us, jump out the window, go to the helicopter, and he breaks his chains, right? That's the moment of liberation. That certainly is, those actions are certainly unfinished. But that doesn't tell us what are the social and structural orders the new society is supposed to have. That's not a form of constitutionalism. That doesn't tell us what type of world we want to live in, but it's an important facet of the world that we want to imagine because it allows us, at least comparatively, to be in a position to try and think about that other world. So in the end, Davis, while she works with thoughts of Douglass and Marcuse, Black Marxism, Black feminism, ultimately she's creating her own system. And what Davis distinctly details, last paragraph, is the unfinished nature of liberation. The act of liberation and the dynamic condition of freedom it provides the terms of appearance for remain ongoing, perpetual processes. Davis remarks in a 2014 interview with The Nation magazine, I would say that as our struggles mature, they produce new ideas, new issues, and the new terrain on which we engage in the quest for freedom. The final sentence of her November 12, 2009 address, Difficult Dialogues, reaffirms this. We fight the same battles over and over again. They're never won for eternity, but in the process of struggling together, in community, we learn how to glimpse new possibilities that otherwise never would have become apparent to us, and in the process we expand and enlarge our very notion of freedom. By taking seriously the abolitionism of Angela Y. Davis and the charge to end slavery in all forms between past and future, we forever change not only our perceptions of utopian politics and the meanings of democracy and freedom, we rewrite the landscapes of African American political thought and modern political thought as a whole. Thank you for the time. Principles of the book, discussions of Davis, or maybe things that are on your mind that this sparks your imagination. So,
I just have one quick comment to make.
Sure.
As you know, I have to run off.
Of course.
But one of the interesting things about this notion of marronage and Fugitive, I've recently been reading, not around it, but come across a really great book, an essay by Ian Hacking, Traveling Men, about the phenomenon of automated fugitiveness and automated ambulatory states in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I've got the passage here that I think will be sort of helpful, and I'll read it to you because this is as a result of the kind of treatment that this happens, right? In the late 19th, early 20th century, well into the mid 20th century. The fugitive was considered an antisocial act. The fugue with the term as an antisocial act. Every individual has obligations under which he lives. From the moment that he breaks a social contract, be it instinctively or involuntarily, he puts himself outside legality. That is the case of the fugueur, who abandons his domicile, and that is why the fugue is an antisocial act. Immediately, the idea of fugitiveness is immediately tied into a whole series of police measures that want to prevent movement, right, and want to prevent circulation. Well, earlier on, of course, but certainly within the 19th and 20th century. And so within the context, within the operations which you're working with, I think it's really important to emphasize this notion of the limits to freedom as limits to movability, right, and circulation, which of course, unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of today, because shooting a black man dead really stops his circulation and movement.
Yeah. So for those, when you get a chance to do it, my one non-poli-sci allergy was that on page 118, I got one chart. And so this is a chart where I basically try, and I know you can't see it, but there are copies of the book afterwards, where I basically try and schematically, basically by this point, I basically want the reader to say is, if you still don't understand what I'm trying to do, at least this will help us along. And I think this is to answer your question. So I want to go back to where I started with in the talk, which was how marronage has been historically understood. The idea of what's called petit marronage. These are kind of there's non-gender specific, right? The kind of individual runaway, right? Someone's kind of running away, or this idea of these kind of maroon societies of grand marronage. So you can't read it, but grand marronage. So individuals who have some kind of space in the hills, in the marshes, etc. There is, if I understood your question, or at least through hacking, there is a sense in which there is a way in which mobility, right? There's a kind of sense in which mobility very much dictates, right? In that kind of classical understanding is very much central to, and especially physical, right? The physical notion of flight. And I would even bring up the earlier point in terms of exodus, right? Exodus not just a metaphor, but actually in terms of the physical leaving Egypt, right? Jews leaving to go to Palestine, to go to a homeland, to go to Zion or Canaan, right? But what I'm actually trying to do is, and I didn't get a chance to talk about this beforehand, is the book I then introduced two other notions of marronage. The first I call sovereign marronage. So this is the idea that I'm suggesting that there are individuals who find their freedom collectively at the mass level through the figure of, through some type of sovereign figure. Call it a deity or gods. Call it a political leader. I would call it the U.S. 2008 election moment, right, for many. In my book, I have a chapter on Toussaint Louverture. That many, in terms of those who are interested in the Haitian Revolution, that it's as if the Haitian Revolution and Toussaint and freedom are all isomorphic, that they are together, and that the sense in which black slaves, men and women, there is a way in which Toussaint is thrust as the figure in which this mass has to imagine itself through that, right, through that figure's agency. But the last notion that I call sociogenic marronage, you see all these arrows kind of going, which is saying that I'm interested in revolution. I don't know about the rest of you. I'm interested in how an entire social and political order can be overturned. And back to the question of mobility, and this is why the Douglas chapter, so there's a couple chapters that are really technical. The Douglas chapter is very technical. But the upshot of the Douglas chapter is to say that I think that what Douglas was trying to do, and then Davis realized that this is what Douglas was trying to do in part, was to realize that, getting back to mobility, is that we think that physical model, right, those physical models of flight is it. So in a lot of ways, that 19th century, early 20th century, mid 20th century point about that mobility is central to the political language of how one thinks about notions of flight. What I'm suggesting is there's also the kind of the cognitive, there's the metaphysical. There are different ways in which we're having flight. So go back to Morpheus, I can be enchained, right? Or legally even, and yet after the fight with Kobe, Douglas is suggesting, and I buy it, that there was a mutation in how he imagined himself, and by extension, that was a certain type of mobility that was non-kind of physical, was non-corporeal. Right? And then, more importantly, at the macro level, if we think of sociogenic marronage, I kind of take the term from Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mass, where he says the black Antillean is because of racial slavery and also colonialism, is thrust into the zone of non-being, which is a sterile and arid region that is ironically a region in which an authentic upheaval can be born. We can actually imagine, so the second chapter of the Haitian Revolution, and also the latter part of the book, is looking at of enslaved agents themselves, right? That is actually considered, like the term black civil society. Enslaved agents is usually considered oxymoronic. in my view. But if we actually say that enslaved peoples actually have the capacity, right, for action, and if we actually look at the Haitian Revolution as looking at these different facets of mass revolutionary politics that take your point and Hacken's point of taking more seriously the ways in which mobility does constrain, right? Going back to the Moreton Bay Rebellion, right? The Moreton Bay Rebellion wasn't a revolution because there were certain limits to mobility that then killed that particular rebellion from becoming a revolution. But if we actually think of this more nuanced, multivalent way of thinking about revolutionary politics, and then also the first, the kind of first main chapter of Rousseau's The Social Contract, man is born free and yet everywhere is enchained, how can that be? That's not a contradiction if you think of the ways in which there are many of us that don't have chains around our arms and we're profoundly alienated. You know those people, right? There are people who you think they just, as if they're operating in the world, or the discourse on post-racialism, right? How can we actually talk about post-racialism when black and brown bodies, young people, are getting murdered, they're getting killed? I won't say the crime, but what is so disturbing with Baltimore is you're having individuals who are then, right, not only resisting police brutality, but then in terms of bails, we're having bails right, up to $500,000. You guys follow this? $500,000 for bail when individuals who are supposedly, possibly, could be accused are out, right? are out early. I mean, this is a structural issue that my concern here is there is immobility that allows for the possibility for someone, let's say a black youth who then gets, whether that one case of the parent or guardians who then said you should go to the police, and say what you did if you smashed a window, as opposed to just saying, well, maybe this is a part of maybe this is a part of revolution, and then they have this huge bail. There are limits, but I want to suggest that I take Hacken's point, but I think that it's part of this broader narrative, and I think that broader narrative actually means, and so the historians and anthropologists who read this book are not going to like it, right? Because they think that there's a very classical definition. And maroon societies, by the way, are not a thing of the 15th century. I mean, Suriname has Jamaica, there are maroon communities that are still in existence. But I want us to think of how do we actually talk about different notions of mobility, different notions of flight that do not disavow the kind of the physical and arms struggle, but actually are a different type of resistance. And I think that's why Davis intrigues me, is I think that she actually is looking at the ways in which lyrical thought, which is, I teach work on the art, so the kind of artists, while the artists are a minority of the faith, the artists themselves have been the ones that have actually spread knowledge of the faith around the world. And there's a way in which lyrical thought gets to people in a certain type of way. Lady Day's discussion of strange fruit gets to us in a different type of way. The blues gets to us, right, in a different type of way, that as in terms of race rebels, in different ways, that there's a way in which we can communicate, right, hidden transcripts, as well as public transcripts. That is, in some sense, I'm trying to destabilize the very way that we're trying to think about resistance and also questions of flight. Yeah, please.
Okay,
and then
so
we'll go. Yeah, let's go. Yeah.
I think that the person right before me kind of took my
Sorry.
question, but thank you for having
Yeah,
an
you can have
answer.
another question.
No, I made a whole bunch of questions, so I'll just pick another one.
Yeah.
'Cause I'm jogging away.
Yeah.
I'm in this wonderful class with Professor Bob Myers. Right behind that thing, you can't see
Okay,
him.
hello.
But we've been discussing the philosophical roots of scientific racism.
Okay.
Right? And so in the class, we talked about this concept of drapetomania.
Yes.
And so before he asked, and you got a little bit deeper
Yeah.
into your terms, so I was just thinking of these poles between freedom and marronage, and the act of running away, and fugitivity, and all of these terms. And I wanted to kind of get you to kind of explain how you were working with it, and then you already broke it down with your sovereign different versions. So what I was thinking about when you were talking about the matrix, that we're all starting to believe. I mean, if we're in here, we're really wanting to learn, or if we're in the Black Lives Matter movement, or if we're, you see the kids in Baltimore, we're starting to believe, like you're saying, like Neo, right? But we seem to be in like this quicksand of the petty marronage, where we are running away, but it's only for the moment to be returned because of the systemic structures that are around us. So my question was, we tasted a bit of this with the Baltimore uprising, and I felt like this oncoming of drapetomania, where I wanted to, get this disease, where I wanted to run away too. So how do we kind of, and I'm just making this new question up since my question was the man earlier was, as an organizer, there's three of us in here, how do we, knowing the issues of mobility that we have, use these definitions that you've
Yeah.
outlined in your book
Yeah.
in order to have this fugitivity that is needed?
Yeah.
Like, what do you imagine your vision of how we could free or liberate ourselves, a la,
Yeah.
Angela Davis, in the current movements that we're in today?
So the first thing is, I think, what we mean by the term revolution. I want to start there.
Yes.
So one thing I talked about in the book, in the first chapter, is revolution in political language came in English in the 16th and 17th century. So it initially meant, for kind of in terms of astronomers, right? It meant, if this is point A, then a revolution meant returning around the stars, right? And still, this is kind of before the sense of, right, the sun revolves around the earth versus, right, the theories in terms of the Western world, the earth revolves around the sun. The idea meant to return to a preset point. Then with the Glorious Revolution in Great Britain in 1688, the idea was there was monarchy that was kicked out. So the idea was restoration, because I'm going to get back to your point. The idea was, how can and this is the Game of Thrones, you guys went to Game of Thrones, so it's taken a very terrible turn in the last episode, but nonetheless, the kind of larger idea, in terms of things that Davis is talking, in terms of the question, rape, the dialectics of rape, meaning serious issues, right? The issue, though, in terms of back to the Glorious Revolution, was then revolution in political language meant a monarchy or a family that was kicked out. The idea was, how do you struggle to then return or restore that original family to its moment? And that could be a profoundly conservative project, right? And then with the Age of Revolution, so people like Hannah Arendt want to talk about the American and the French Revolution, but the Haitian Revolution, which I read and many others don't, that Age of Revolution was the first to break out, this makes sense, at the political level, to break out of revolution as simply a return to some prior order that in many sense restoration can be radical, but many times it's a conservative project, to actually creating something new. So getting back to the issue of yourself, the activists here, Black Lives Matters, and the ways in which there are those who are like me starting to believe, but then there are others. I take Zora Neale Hurston's dictum very well. My skin folk are not necessarily my kinfolk. She said that my skin folk are not necessarily my kinfolk, and there's a way in which the paradox of Baltimore is the issue of how do you talk about Black lives when there's Black mayor, Black police commissioner, Black head of the county, people who look like us, or let's say not at the level of race, who have an affinity, right? And we think that in some sense that means automatically political, solidarity. And then, secondly, the issue of, well, what is the project going in terms of this kind of, is it as Frank Harris says, are we in a moment or a movement, right? Because a moment suggests that, you can have the placards, or you can be tweeting, or you can have the kind of e-activism, but is that actually about restoration of some type of normal, so-called normal state that itself is fairly limiting in its long-term efficacy, or is it trying to have people like yourself thinking about not simply having a conscience? Remember that quote I read at the beginning, Baldwin, Baldwin reflecting on Davis. That it's a power. That piece is so powerful. Sure, it's a new consciousness, right? Yeah. Because to me, it's the new consciousness versus the change. So it's these stakes are real. So I think the challenge is, with regards to marronage, is why I'm not actually trying to get rid of the language of petit marronage and grand marronage. I'm trying to say that there are all of these different conceptions of how we think about freedom and democracy going on at the same time. I myself have a preference for the sociogenic, but I also recognize that my ideals might be different than some others. I think the mistake is when we think that there are not people, even those who look like us, who don't have a different ideal. Is this starting to get to your question? Yeah. That's the problem, and this is getting back to the prompt in terms of the kind of the so-called age, right, of Obama, right? Is that I think a lot of people think Obama, came into office and then, in some sense, disavowed his constituency. I think Obama was very clear as being a kind of a liberal democratic politician. There was a promise that he was supposed to be the anti-politician, but he was a politician of a certain form. So I actually he has done amazing things, I think. And at the same time, some of the questions that even people within the Democratic Party, let alone left of the Democratic Party, when they want to critique policies of the president, they're getting trapped in the Zora Neale Hurston point. Yeah. And that is not to say that the president doesn't, have concerns with Black people and other politicians with those who are there. And so I think that's why it's not the only one. I realize I didn't talk about, besides the book, not just the Haitian Revolution, but there's a way in which initially when I wrote it, it kind of ended 18th century, and I was like, it seems too far for me. So how can we actually think about it? So someone who I just urge all of you to read, please read, is Edward Glissant. Not because I think Edward Glissant has the answers, but especially in Black studies. I think a lot of it is due to not only mistranslations, but bastardized translations of someone in particular, I talked about in the book, who has a certain type of Creole politics. that is not as actually as radical as what Glissant was offering. And Glissant is the only figure that I've ascertained in the 20th century who both in his fiction and in his non-fiction writings and his poetry actually took the marronage and the figure of the maroon central in, even though he didn't actually use the vocabulary of the sovereign and the sociogenic, he was actually describing, in some sense, a lot of the things I have wanted to try and articulate. And so I think that there's a ways between that, the kind of the Rastafari movement, and also what I didn't get to write about because it was unfolding after the book published, which I'm hoping I want to write about with regards to, we don't know, we're in the middle in terms of this consciousness kind of raising, but I guess to end the response is that point I was making about revolution. I think that we all need to try and figure out what we mean by that, and that's my kind of small pet peeve with Davis, is that I think she's right to talk about that liberation is ongoing, but I think that there are ways in which the actual scholar activism, the writing and her writings and her kind of activism have actually given us a window into that sociogenic turn. That is not just about the liberation, right, freeing from our chains. I think she's actually giving us a way to try and understand and a way to organize and a way to say, I don't even have all the answers, but I want to ignite in our individual social and political imaginations the capacity to try and imagine what that is. C.L.R. James in the Johnson Force tendency said it best, right? Facing reality, right? The new society. How do we actually, I think this is James's imperative, how do we actually imagine that new society that has not come into being, but we need to do it, unless we basically get trapped back in the matrix. And that's why there are the lines on the chart that go back, which is maybe we do arrive at the so-called ideal state, then we can become complacent, you know? We can think things are going to sustain, and then there can be retrenchments. And I think that's the worry I have, but I tend to be a hopeful person, so I know there was a hands in the back. Oh, yeah.
Hey. Thanks for the talk. It was really great. So, you know, I was thinking a lot about Sylvia Wynter's book, The Hills of Hebron, when you were talking, and it kind of, maybe there's actually a better way to get to this through Angela Davis, because you just mentioned rape. And the reason why I bring up Hills of Hebron is because I was trying to sort of think about sovereign marronage, and maybe it will help me think a little bit about sociogenic marronage, the way you're thinking about it. But one of the things that happens is the community is established in a way through violence against women, right? And so, there's a community that, you know, is in flight, and they flee, and they establish this community in Jamaica in the 30s, in this sort of place called Hebron. But it is all kind of done through rape and sort of violating women. And so I'm kind of just wondering and thinking about like what it means then, sort of when flight has to sort of found something, right? Like it has to sort of become established and congealed into a community, and how that happens, and kind of like how the sort of internal dynamics of power congeal, and maybe there is a better way to get at this through Davis that you can help me think through. But,
thanks for good. So full disclosure, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Sylvia Wynter, and so now there's been a lot of energy, I think rightly so, to kind of focusing on Sylvia Wynter's work. I kind of felt like I was mentioned Sylvia Wynter, and I was like, who? You know, outside of the Caribbean. But I think you're right. And for those who haven't read Sylvia Wynter's The Hills of Hebron, it was published in the early 1960s, and also around the time, 2 years before Orlando Patterson's The Children of Sisyphus. So one thing I talked about in the intro is that I actually think Orlando Patterson was fairly radical in his Caribbean writings. It was kind of after a certain period, the U.S. turn, that I think there was the retrenchment, including that recent New York Times op-ed. But to your question in terms of that originary moment, is there a kind of, does this flight, if I understood you in some sense, rest on some type of originary moment? And what does it mean if that originary moment is, let's say, a moment of rape, or a moment of, that there needs to be some type of act, am I understanding you to try and figure it out? Because The Hills of Hebron is a novel where on the one hand, at the period in which Jamaica historically is on the kind of cusp of independence in '62, looking at, so I believe it's Miss Gotha, right? So the kind of the figure of Miss Gotha and this kind of revival community. So in essence, there really is, it's not a book about the Rastafari movement like Patterson's The Children of Sisyphus, but also this kind of Jamaican revival community that does really kind of go to the hills. It forms this commune. And then there's a way in which there's a narrative of freedom within this commune that is heavily kind of liturgical and scriptural, and yet there are these dynamics going on that seem to kind of contradict the kind of the acts, and in a sense the kind of this rape, this original sin seems to happen. So I guess I would kind of answer, which is that I think the Hills of Hebron and Sylvia Wynter's work on the kind of the difference between man and the human, the Catherine McKittrick, if you ever read those, kind of the great volume that came out on Sylvia Wynter's idea of the human, is that I think the Hills of Hebron actually sets up the terms to think of, in that case, a kind of an attempt at kind of an anti-colonial context, an anti-colonial form of revolution, and what would it mean to get to Zion, and that what does it mean that those within one's community, that while they might be in this particular enclosed space that is maroon-like, that space also has a lot of contradictions and problems. And so I actually don't think that, to kind of directly answer the question with regards to an originary moment, I don't know if, I mean, I'm taking as a premise that we're all enslaved, so there is a certain type of I guess that is a certain type of originary moment. I guess the question is, what do we do from that particular, right? What do we do from that particular period? And when those within a community, let's say in a revival context, have this point that Davis, I think, really gets us to think about. I think it's the struggle for what type of, as Césaire says, near the end of the middle of the discourse in colonialism, what type of humanism are we trying to enact? A humanism made to the measure of the world, as Césaire says, or a humanism that itself actually also has forms of hierarchy of those within our own community? And I think that that's what part, I don't know if I got to all your question, is that I think that that's what is part and parcel of what Sylvia Wynter's trying to think about, and thinking of the shifts from kind of political man, as she calls it, to kind of bioeconomic man, or what we might, or Davis might call it kind of the neoliberal moment, to then how do we imagine, right, the next kind of epistemic, right, the next epistemic change. And I actually think that in the Glissant chapter, one of the epigraphs is Sylvia Wynter on Edward Glissant, where she's actually talking about the kind of the figure of the maroon, and the classical figure of the maroon, she says, as non-domesticated, which she means like, how do we actually have certain retentions, epistemological and otherwise, or cultural, that we can retain, but then what does it mean if we can't preserve a past that might be foregone? What type of world are we supposed to live in? So I don't think the original moment has to be a moment of rape, but I think if the original moment is understood as kind of a moment of enslavement in different forms, then the Wynterian notion of kind of the struggle for the human is, I interpret Wynter's notion of the struggle for the human as marronage. I mean, I think that that is exactly what it is. And last full disclosure is that I don't mention the acknowledgments that Sylvia Wynter, after I graduated and kind of kept in contact, had was the one who actually told me about the Césaire poem that I analyzed in the introduction, which is the verb, translated the verb marronner. Aimé Césaire wrote this poem where he talks about the kind of the idea of maroons with regards to the Haitian Revolution, but he coins his own neologism. It was years ago. It was just in passing. So there actually is a connection. It wasn't to the Hills of Hebron, but it actually, I think, though she hasn't articulated it, I think the struggle for the human is the struggle for new forms of life and these notions of flight.
We have time for one more question, and then before whoever you choose, don't leave before those books are sold there. So people need to get those books. He'll sign it for you, but I just want to feed this man.
Yeah, thank you.
Neil, I'm really looking forward to read this book. I mean, your energy is infectious, as always. And so I'm going to ask a question that's selfish.
Sure.
Because I study international migration.
Yeah.
And so listening to you talk about freedom as marronage is making me think about my respondents, which are those living in this liminal space of legal violence, the undocumented, who often describe their positions in the labor market as exploited, as types of enslavement, although certainly not of the same degree or magnitude or historical significance.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, have you thought about this? Now that I know you have different conceptualizations of marronage, I'm wondering in what ways you think maybe one conception over another, or sort of this sort of constellation of ideas might be helpful to those of us thinking about the undocumented circa now.
Yeah, so I'm going to read from the book, which I haven't done. The last section of the Glissant chapter fast forwards, and it's before Glissant passed away, and so he in 2007 he published a political manifesto that's translated as When the Walls Fall, which was, Glissant was from Martinique, but he worked within spaces between Martinique, Louisiana, New York, and then France. And so he was actually writing at the end of his life about the kind of with regards to the EU the European Union and the ways in which undocumented, in terms of how are people going across borders, not only within Europe, but we see this now in terms of the contempt, you guys are probably following in terms of what's happening in terms of North Africans, right? There was recently 1,000, right? North Africans were on a ship that just, right, plunged to the bottom of the sea, and there was this debate about how do we actually talk about it. I mean, I know you might not be talking about that context, but it is something that I wasn't initially writing about, so I decided to write on this manifesto at the end, so I'm just going to read this section. This stance complements Glissant's assertion that, quote, we are not the owners of the earth, we are the custodians of the earth, who must espouse an attitude of inclusion rather than exclusion. Glissant's dismay with Europe's retrenchment to border policing is coupled with the belief that Europe, like the Caribbean before it, is transforming into an archipelago. Europe, Glissant argues, must develop into what he calls an island region. Official administrative life still takes place through the nation states, but quotidian and cultural life has already gone beyond this stage and has pure regions in contact with one another, end quote. And then this term is mine, what I call I coined a term, I call it the refugee immigrant. The refugee immigrant is a late modern maroon straddling the outward flight into diaspora of genres of grand marronage and macro visions of another world in the blueprints of the sociogenic imagination. Refugee immigrants deny isolationism and perpetual domesticity, and they desire movement across borders throughout the island regions of the globe. Involuntary or stateless, or you could add undocumented, immigrants take lines of flight to flee regimes of unfreedom. Immigrants fleeing to another polity may have reasons that justify flight to a place where the act of becoming can expand. Refugee immigrants, moreover, embody the generative qualities of marronage. Marronage affects agents who are stateless within polities as much as it does on governing apparatuses of the state. And the last thing I talked about is this idea of co-development. So on the one hand, in liberal terms, the French government under Nicolas Sarkozy talked about this idea of, in liberal terms, of kind of integration and the toleration of difference, and yet they then put a cap on how many immigrants could enter the polity. And even though this is the French case, we're seeing this now, going back to what's happening in North Africa, is this larger question of trying to actually quantify. Right? We're like, oh, we don't want 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 people to die in the water. We don't want to keep them either, right? We want to turn them around. We want to have asylum, have a discussion. And to me, this is just a prelude, going back to the Caribbean context of what we know of the asymmetry between kind of different forms of those who flee, for instance, Haiti, compared to Cuba. During there's this normalization period, but we know the policies are different, right? Edward Danticat trenchantly wrote in the book Brother, I'm Dying, which was a narrative of Danticat, not a narrative, it was Danticat talking about her uncle, who was very close to her in Haiti, who then got detained by the INS in Miami, and then because of, they were like, are you going to send him back? He was indefinitely detained, he died in detention. And this discussion in terms of toleration of difference tends to assume that all immigrants are undocumented or stateless are being treated the same way, but we know this is actually not the case. And so for me, I wish I'd spent more time on it, but your discussion of migration, I'd love to talk and hear more about it, is I think that this is where the book ends, is really a prompt for all of us, and even those beyond me, to think of, well, what does it mean for talking about this kind of figure of the migrant? Because one of the things I push against in the book is the turn to diaspora. I understand the necessity. I talk about the ways in which John Hope Franklin's Between Slavery and Freedom was a catalytic text for black studies, right? But there is a way in which it was interpreted in a certain way to mean that really actually then led to the progenitors of terms such as diaspora, the Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, Carol Boyce Davies, and others have talked about. But there's a way in which diaspora simply is unidirectional, right? It's about kind of going from one place to the other. But what does it mean to not only talk about undocumented and migrants who then enter a polity, leave a polity and enter it, but then also modes of structural change within the spaces that they're leaving, right? That the restructuring has to occur on two levels. There has to be a serious discussion of incorporating people who are contributing like anybody else, just because they have a distinction of paper. I came to this country, I'm a dual citizen from Jamaica. I was green card until I applied to college. The only reason I shifted in terms of having the ability of nationalization was because my sister is 4 years older, she actually couldn't qualify for any scholarships. Most scholarships, even merit-based, because they always had this clause, U.S. Citizen. And even Jamaica's, the status of even documented, not just undocumented. Jamaica shifted from the Michael Manley regime in the 1970s, or the period when Manley was considered close to Fidel Castro. You had to choose, right? Jamaican citizenship, U.S. citizenship by the age of 18. Then it was by the age of 21. Now it has shifted because of the geopolitics of the region. But these questions of the undocumented, the questions of the stateless person, I think they're intertwined. We tend to disaggregate them and think that there are two different sets of conversations. But I actually think that it speaks to this question of migration. Being at last point, I know we're out of time, but speaking to not only the need at the level, going back to Sylvia Winter, of the human, right? If we're actually really concerned about the human, right? Not a perversion of the human. If we're really concerned about the human, then we need to understand that papers alone don't make the human. There's a lot of people in this country right here who have papers they're born in and do not live up to the ideals, right, that many who might be undocumented. And vice versa, also not thinking about flight as simply talking about the incorporation of migrants, but saying, well, what are the politics going on in different spaces and policies that people are leaving that might be, I think, something that we need to consider. I know I see hands, I know we're out of time, but I'll hang around because I'm not going anywhere till tomorrow, so.
Yeah, so these around tomorrow and today. Before we give a very warm thank you, I just want to make 2 announcements. So tomorrow, same time, 12 o'clock, Frank Garitti's giving a talk. It's titled Nation Time at the Coliseum, the Wattstax 72 concert and Black Power in Los Angeles. And then also next week, the great poet Ebby Shockley is going to be speaking, I guess, from 2 o'clock on May 28th. I'll send out announcements, so look out for that. But once again, fabulous, brilliant. Thank
you for coming. Is that I only brought a few copies, so I guess technically I have to be the one to kind of sell those. But I put up 2 things. I put flyers there that have a discount code for 20%. Also, for those of you who are in social media, you don't have to be linked to me. If you just search Freedom is Marronage Facebook page, I worked out a way that same code, if you go on, like purchase it, you can click and you can get it there as well. I didn't know if like 2 people would show up and then, I bought too many books, but I just want to say that even if you don't buy it, at least the conversation, I really appreciate you guys coming today. Thanks.